In September 1949, the Constituent Assembly, interested with the momentous task of framing the Constitution of Independent India, was debating the extremely contentious issues of land reform and the abolition of the zamindari system. At the risk of slightly diminishing the diversity of this fascinating debate, I would put the arguments made by various participants into three broad categories. On the radical side of things, members questioned the right of landlords to demand fair compensation from the government in return for their estates for the purpose of redistributing land to tenants and landless workers. Instead, drawing inspiration from sources as diverse as Mahatma Gandhi, the Upanishads, and the French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, they advocated for minimal compensation and even outright expropriation of zamindars' lands. In opposition to such voices, members representing landlord interests in the assembly generally whined about being treated like parasites and asserted that not only their private property rights be protected against unjust expropriation, but that they also deserved the right to approach the judiciary if they felt the compensation they received from the government was not fair. Finally, the mainstream of the Congress party embodied the third strand of opinion, which was that of moderation between the first two. Prime Minister Nehru himself assured the assembly that expropriation was out of question. His position and that of his associates was to seek a just compromise between the landlords and the state, wherein the property rights of the individual are respected and fair compensation as determined by Parliament paid to them in order to serve the larger interests of the nation. The fate of land reforms in India was obviously not solely determined by this particular debate in the assembly, but the unfolding of independent India's history in its early years pretty much reflected the way the debate played out. Nehru and his associates' centrist position of let's give the landlords an olive branch carried the day, the radicals were defeated, and the landed interests, well, they lost the battle but ultimately won the war by largely obstructing any meaningful and substantial land reform. The historian Gyan Prakash writes, "The landowners took to the courts and invoked the fundamental right to property in the constitution to tie up the legislation and extract expensive compensation from the government. The result was that land reforms affected only 1% of India's total arable land. Of the 60 million acres estimated as surplus, released by the ceilings imposed by law on the size of land holdings, only a tiny portion was redistributed to the tenants a quarter of a century after independence." Thus, though the zamindari system was technically abolished, the grip of rural elites over agricultural production and social life persisted. The dream of a social revolution that would sweep away all the remnants of parasitical control from the countryside remained just that, a dream. As such, the Indian state was not very successful, to be fair, nor was it a total failure, in remedying the deep malaise of Indian agriculture it had inherited from the colonial period by failing to effect a more equitable distribution of land and the value of its produce. Instead, the state eventually took the productionist approach to improving agriculture. As Prakash writes, faced with resistance from landlords, the state placed institutional reform secondary to the goal of improving agricultural production. Accordingly, irrigation and chemical fertilizers received high priority, which favored richer cultivators and landowners and aggravated rural inequality. This subordination of land reforms to increasing agricultural production using technology while leaving the stratified structure of rural society largely untouched is one of the key developments that influenced the direction and outcome of independent India's agricultural policies. Developments outside India played a crucial part in ensuring that a technological fix to the problem of agricultural production was available to the Indian state. As noted at the end of part 1, mechanical equipment and fertilizers had been in use in developed countries, especially the USA, before World War II. But it was only in the 1950s that the final element of the Green Revolution package, the high-yielding seeds, were developed under the tutelage of the US government and the Rockefeller Foundation. The spread of this package to third world countries and its eventual success in increasing agricultural production is generally portrayed as a brilliant triumph of technology and philanthropy. In reality, though, the export of the Green Revolution package was an intensely political phenomenon, and the motivations behind it had less to do with philanthropy or the eradication of world hunger and more to do with American geopolitical considerations and opening up markets for the manufacturers of Green Revolution technologies. The Cold War thus provides the crucial context for understanding the spread of the Green Revolution to the Third World, as it was considered a powerful weapon to blunt the appeal of communism. The following excerpt from a report issued by the Rockefeller Foundation in 1951 illustrates how the American foreign policy goal of containing the so-called communist threat in the Third World was linked to the question of food. Whether additional millions will become communists will depend partly on whether the communist world or the free world fulfills its promises. Hungry people are lured by promises, but they may be won by deeds. Communism makes attractive promises to underfed peoples. Democracy must not only promise as much, but must deliver more. In fact, even the origin of the term Green Revolution was rooted in American Cold War anti-communism. The term was deliberately coined to contrast with the phrase Red Revolution and the notion that developing countries were to undergo far-reaching changes as a result of an agricultural revolution rather than because of radical political transformation gives a clue to the political interests involved in the generation of the new agricultural technology. The Indian state, having failed to carry out a radical social and political transformation in the countryside, thus found itself drawn irresistibly to the Green Revolution package as the sole means of boosting agricultural production. In this sense, the interests of India's urban ruling class and its rural elites aligned perfectly with those of US foreign policy and US corporations to push Indian cultivators in the direction of capital-intensive agriculture. But despite this synergy between national and international elites, the adoption of the new technology package had to wait a while. The decisive moment, which can be seen as the culmination of these domestic and international trends, occurred against the backdrop of the agricultural crisis in India in the mid-60s. India had already become a net importer of food grains in the final decades of British rule. The loss of highly productive irrigated lands to Pakistan due to the partition rendered India even more dependent on what was termed food aid from the United States. Once again, just as we saw with the phrase Green Revolution, the term food aid is kind of problematic because it too frames the import of food grains in philanthropic terms, as good old Uncle Sam helping out not just India but numerous countries in the decolonizing world in meeting the food demands of their growing populations as these countries embarked on their much delayed capitalist development. The reality, however, was that the flow of so-called food aid to developing countries resolved an important structural problem within American agriculture while also allowing the US government to exert political control over the actions of recipient governments in the third world. See, American agriculture since the 1930s had faced a surplus of grain production above domestic demand, which it had trouble disposing of in foreign markets as exports. First due to the collapse of trade because of the Great Depression, and then due to World War II as the major importers of US grains in Europe promoted policies of food self-sufficiency and protectionism. A temporary solution to the problem of American food grain surpluses after the war was found in shipping food to reconstructing Europe. But as Europe recovered, it began to view American imports as inimical to food security and independence. This, writes Tony Weiss, forced the USA to look elsewhere for surplus outlets, and elsewhere quickly became the decolonizing South. In 1954, the US government established Public Law 480, the Agricultural Trade Development and Assistance Act, which was subsequently molded by the strong lobby of grain trading and processing companies. Weiss continues, with PL 480, the USA institutionalized food aid and concessional sales to the developing world as a primary means for dumping its grain surpluses. Food aid and concessional sales were variously an extension of domestic agricultural policy, a means to establish new markets for future commercial sales, and a foreign policy tool during the Cold War with geostrategic objectives. India became one of the major recipients of food aid under PL 480, but the downsides of being dependent on such aid soon became apparent. A severe drought in 1965-66 caused a 27% fall in domestic food grain production, and despite an increase in imports, including 10 million tons of grain from the US, food shortages persisted and prices increased. Then the monsoon failed again in 1966-67, and this time, the US government, good old Uncle Sam, gave the Indian government a giant middle finger, partly as punishment for India's critical view of the US involvement in Vietnam. The other, more important reason was to withhold food aid to advance American business interests by pushing for a change in India's agricultural policy. The historian B.R. Tomlinson writes, the Johnson administration saw its opportunity to exert pressure on New Delhi to implement new economic policies that would favor private enterprise and foreign investment, especially in agriculture. To achieve this, Johnson adopted a short tether policy, refusing to commit PL 480 shipments more than 1 month in advance, and then only in response to urgent need and the adoption of a policy package of liberal reforms. The new policy was, in the words of John Lewis, the USAID administrator in New Delhi, one of specific aid offers contingent upon the institution of particular adjustments in indigenous rural policy. What John Lewis, the man with the most generic, boring-ass white guy name ever, is trying to say is that, look, We know your country has a terrible history of people dying of hunger. So we're not saying that we won't give you the food. We're not saying we will starve your country. But why don't you give gazillion-dollar contracts to my buddies who make chemical fertilizers, and then we can talk about the food. In the popular retelling of the history of the Green Revolution, this moment is depicted as one of national humiliation and loss of sovereignty, following which the Indian government ditched the so-called ship-to-mouth strategy and embraced the goal of food security and sufficiency. Which is not wrong. It is indeed a pivotal moment, a crisis that forced a switch in strategy. But what largely escapes public discussion is that this crisis did have an upside for the Indian elite, as it allowed them to permanently sidestep the thorny issue of land reforms. As we've seen, the land reform process got steadily derailed in the post-independence years, to the point that pathway of increasing agricultural production and subsequent industrialization, similar to that taken in its Big C communist and capitalist forms in the post-World War II era by China and South Korea respectively, was a dead end for India. And the Green Revolution package provided, as Weiss points out, a means of increasing food production without upsetting entrenched interests, as well as a means of providing increased revenues to Western firms supplying industrial inputs, and thus represented an alternative to agrarian reform. Unable and or unwilling to bring about a social revolution and broad-based prosperity to rural India, the Indian state was not so much bullied into changing its agricultural strategy by Lyndon Johnson's strong-arm tactics, as it was decisively nudged in the direction it was already moving towards. Or as Tomlinson puts it, over agricultural policy, the American administration was knocking at a door that was already at least half open. But even as Indian policy planners successfully evaded the land reform question, they had to confront another one, namely how to implement a highly capital-intensive agricultural model in a country where access to capital in rural areas was severely restricted. As things stood at the time, only a small portion of farmers would be able to purchase the high-yielding seeds, farm equipment, the petrochemical fertilizers, and the pesticides. Most of the country's cultivators were too poor to afford anything of that sort. Further, the Green Revolution package also required access to ample irrigation facilities for it to work, which further geographically restricted the scope of its adoption. Because of these reasons, there was a substantial element of inequality built into the model. That is, its very nature was such that not everyone, everywhere, would be able to adopt it with a similar degree of success. It fell on the government then to intervene in order to reduce these inequalities and at least try to ensure that farmers who did not have access to the requisite capital were not completely left behind by the model. One area of government activity was the building of massive dams and canal networks to improve irrigation access. However, the main area of intervention lay in creating institutional support for the agricultural model that was key to the model's wider adoption and functioning. Broadly speaking, 6 kinds of institutional supports were introduced. First, price support, which led to the creation of the Agricultural Prices Commission in 1965 to advise the government on the level of prices that would act as an incentive for the adoption of technologies. Further, to reconcile the interests of producers of food and consumers, the Food Corporation of India was set up to procure food grains at remunerative prices and distribute them through the public distribution system at subsidized prices. Second, credit support was absolutely essential in breaking the hold of the exploitative parasitical money lender, and to this end, bank nationalization in 1969 and the policy of treating agriculture as a priority sector for lending helped to mop up the liquidity in the rural areas, improve the geographical spread and functional reach of public banks, and ultimately increase the availability of credit for the peasants, which could then be invested in their farms. Third, through input subsidy support, the prices of fertilizers, pesticides and electricity for irrigation were controlled so as to encourage adoption and keep input costs under control. And further, marketing support was required to implement the price supports, to improve the bargaining position of the seller of agricultural produce vis-a-vis the buyer, and to restrict price volatility due to speculation and hoarding. For these purposes, the Agricultural Produce and Marketing Committee Act and the Essential Commodities Act were passed in states to regulate the marketing of farm produce by minimizing distortions in exchange. Under the APMC Act, a number of regulated markets were set up across the country. For fairly obvious reasons, the functioning of price and marketing supports would be impacted quite adversely if the flow of agricultural commodities to and from international markets, especially food, was completely unrestricted. Given that these forms of support were concerned with imparting price stability for both producers and consumers, unchecked imports and exports would seriously undermine that goal by influencing domestic prices, as we saw in the colonial period. Thus, agricultural trade policy was geared towards regulating the volume and value of exports and imports through a number of measures: licenses, quotas, government import-export monopolies, etc. These measures, by contributing to price stability and enabling price and marketing supports to function smoothly, can be considered as another pillar of institutional support. And finally, publicly funded agricultural research and extension services that provide technical advice and inputs to farmers formed the sixth and final institutional support mechanism of the Green Revolution agricultural model. To our 21st century brains, poisoned by 40 years of neoliberal dogma, all this government intervention in markets, trade protectionism, and treating agricultural research as a public good, all this leaves kind of a bad taste in the mouth, and all of these policies are now condemned as vestiges of India's socialist past, just like other misguided economic policies from that era. There are a couple of problems with that kind of reasoning. First, as I mentioned above, the reason these institutions even came to be was that the Indian state chose to try and limit, however effectually or ineffectually, the unequal outcomes of introducing a capital-intensive agricultural development model in a capital-scarce country, rather than try to address the issue of capital scarcity itself by enforcing a radical redistribution of rural wealth and land, which would have also had the added benefit of significantly flattening social hierarchies. That was a strategic choice regarding the path to capitalist development. It has very little to do with socialism, unless even a minimal amount of concern for equity and justice shown by the state can be equated with socialism. Even more important, though, is the fact that India was not alone in following such policies in agriculture. Unsurprisingly, it was the United States, which pioneered many institutional support mechanisms for agriculture starting in the 1930s. Price support, credit support, export subsidies, government procurement, public research, etc. And post the Second World War, governments all over the world adapted these according to the specific needs of their countries. At the international level, agriculture was excluded from the scope of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, the major post-World War II US-backed multilateral free trade agreement, simply because it was in nobody's interest to promote free trade in agriculture. The leader of the free world and champion of free markets, the USA, which has a long and glorious history of protectionism from the 19th century, had to protect its own agriculture from imports in the 20th, which had a substantial impact on international and domestic agricultural policies of the entire world. As Harriet Friedman writes, US trade restrictions designed to protect domestic farm programs encouraged other states to focus on their own national agro-food sectors. States replicated the US regulation of national sectors but adapted policies to their locations in the food regime. For continental Europe, this meant shifting the focus of protective agricultural policies away from tariffs and redesigning trade protection around domestic support for farm prices. For other parts of the world, adaptation of the US model involved parallel shifts in the forms of state agricultural regulation. Thus, the post-war rules did not liberalize national agricultural policy but created a new pattern of intensely national regulation. Modern industrial farming, as we know it then, emerged and matured in this highly protectionist environment and was basically propped up everywhere, from the US and Europe to India and Africa, by massive state support. And it can be argued that it could not exist as it did in the absence of either of those things, protectionism and state support. And the bigger the state, the bigger the support. So not only was India in any way an outlier for subsidizing its agricultural development, it was totally dwarfed in that regard by the two agricultural behemoths, the USA and the European Union, both of which plowed in ever larger amounts of subsidies into their respective agricultural sectors, even as these subsidies continued to fuel overproduction and put a consistent downward pressure on prices. It was this subsidy war between the USA and EU which partly prompted the reorganization of world agricultural trade in the late 80s and 90s that came to be codified in the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Agriculture. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have some unfinished business with the Green Revolution. How do we evaluate its impact on Indian agriculture? Honestly, for me at least, it's hard to even talk about clear-cut positives and negatives. It's all very ambiguous. Okay, so it undoubtedly helped increase India's food production enough so it wasn't reliant on imports from abroad. That's a great and noteworthy achievement, but one can't help but think that maybe we could have gone for a development strategy that didn't just promote a relatively small number of commercially minded landowners concentrated in only a few regions to the top of the rural socio-economic pyramid, while leaving a large number of those at the bottom behind. When they get left behind, their incomes don't grow. And when incomes of those at the bottom don't grow, you can produce all the food you want in the world, but people won't be able to consume more. Attaining food security in the sense of ending import dependence is kind of a hollow victory then, if food consumption of broad swathes of your population is not growing at the same rate as food production is. In fact, National Sample Survey data from the 70s to the 90s shows that rural nutritional poverty, that is, the proportion of people whose daily food consumption amounted to less than 2400 kilocalories, remained above 70% throughout the early and late Green Revolution period, suggesting food consumption remained very low even as production increased drastically and India had technically attained food security. What about the institutional support mechanisms that were supposed to remedy this inequality built into the system? Well, it has to be noted that these institutions themselves were functioning on top of rigid social hierarchies, and thus access to the benefits of these institutions was itself unequal, especially for the socially weakest sections of society, as Griffin explains. Extension agents concentrate on the large farmers. Credit agencies concentrate on low-risk borrowers. Those who sell fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemical inputs concentrate on cultivators who are likely to buy the largest quantities. State organizations tend to provide services to those from whom the government seeks approval, and in most instances, these are the large landowners. Unless there is scale neutrality in the institutions which support the Green Revolution, unless small peasants have equal access to knowledge, finance, and material inputs, innovation will inevitably favor the prosperous and the secure at the expense of the poor and the insecure. The Green Revolution then, instead of curing the deep rot in Indian agriculture inherited from the colonial period, actually exacerbated rural inequalities. And that is just the social cost. If we were to take into consideration the ecological costs of pumping ever larger quantities of fertilizers, insecticides, and pesticides into the soil, of the depletion of groundwater, of the greenhouse gas emissions, of soil erosion, and all the other environmentally destructive things modern industrial farming entails, if we take all that into account, one really begins to wonder at what cost did we increase our production and who really benefited from it. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I think we've reached the point where we can tie all the strands together and wrap up this extremely long but hopefully not completely useless story. We began the story in the sugar plantations of 16th century Brazil, one of the sites of a historic transformation in agriculture as it shifted away from being a localized, subsistence-driven activity to one that became intimately linked to international trade and finance, and was driven by the need to maximize profits earned in the market. These developments led to the creation of plantation agriculture, an early prototype of capital-intensive industrial farming based on division of labor, and market imperatives pushed planters towards rampant overexploitation of both slave labor and the environment. By the 1870s, technological developments like railways, steamships, telegraph, etc., and the ideology of free trade had helped to usher in the first age of globalization, and the international market for agricultural commodities came to include for the first time food grains. The United States was not the only beneficiary of fulfilling the growing demand of cheap food grains from industrializing Europe, but in the ensuing decades it did become the site of the next major transformation in agriculture by combining smallholder peasant capitalism with labor-saving technology and chemical inputs, pioneering industrial farming as we know it today. By successfully using smallholder commercial agriculture as a basis for industrialization, with a little help from a continent-wide genocide of indigenous people, industrial protectionism, and ecological destabilization, this peculiarly American form of agriculture would, after World War II and decolonization, be held up as a model that was to be emulated by the newly independent countries of the global South. Meanwhile, by the middle of the 19th century, the British had managed to turn India from an important exporter of handicraft textiles into primarily an exporter of agricultural commodities. This was to be India's place in the international division of labor, as a source of cheap food grains and raw materials for industrializing countries to tap into, and at the same time to provide a market for British industrial products, most importantly textiles. India was forced into this position by the colonial capture of domestic policy, which was framed to further British imperial, industrial, and financial interests, and the centerpiece of which was the system of extracting land revenue. The functioning of the system, along with the rapid expansion of railways, ensured that a steady stream of money and commodities kept flowing out of India at the same time that the benefits of international trade completely bypassed the actual cultivators and ultimately went into the hands of a tiny minority of socially dominant large landowners, landlords, traders, and money lenders. Post-independence, the capital-intensive US agricultural model, now with its miracle seeds, was adopted in the face of a food crisis and significant pressure from the American government, philanthropic organizations, and international agencies, whose goal was to blunt the appeal of radical redistribution of land in the backdrop of the Cold War and at the same time serve the interests of American corporations. The land reform issue was permanently put to bed, and with it, the opportunity to right the wrongs of the colonial period and enforce an equitable distribution of resources was lost. A comprehensive comprehensive system of institutional supports was designed to prop up the model and remedy its inaccessibility to capital-scarce cultivators, but the overall results were not so great. Food production increased drastically, but food consumption, especially in rural areas, did not grow at the same pace. International trade in agricultural commodities, with the exception of plantation crops like tea, was restricted and controlled by the government in order to impart price stability at home and protect peasant producers from the vagaries of the international market. In this sense, India managed to break out of its role in the old international division of labor from the colonial period as a provider of agricultural commodities. Although it has to be stressed that at that point of time, every country was engaging in varying degrees of protectionism, especially the USA and EU. After 2.5 decades of stability, though, the economic crisis that engulfed global capitalism in the early 1970s instigated an assault on its hegemonic ideology, Keynesianism, and culminated by the end of the 70s with the victory of the neoliberal counter-revolution and its political advocates Reagan and Thatcher. This ideological shift within capitalism was to have a profound influence on agriculture, especially in the developing world, because suddenly, state support and trade protectionism, which these countries had adapted from the developed world itself, were considered blasphemous by the newly dominant ideology of neoliberalism. The third world debt crisis of the 1980s provided a perfect opportunity for the proponents of neoliberalism to fundamentally alter the economic policies of debtor countries, including agricultural policies, and bring them in line with their free market ideology with the help of the World Bank and the IMF. Weiss explains the background of the debt crisis as follows. The vulnerability of narrow commodity-dependent economies across much of the developing world, which had been partially masked by strong demand and prices during the post-war boom in the 1950s and 60s, was exposed after the onset of global recession in 1972-73, the oil price shock, and declining terms of trade for tropical commodities, leaving much of the developing world with severe balance of payments problems. A common response was to turn to private US capital markets that were eager to reinvest the flood of petrodollars they were receiving. The invested earnings from oil-producing nations, much of which ended up in US banks, and saw developing country governments as seemingly reliable borrowers. But the combination of this heavy borrowing coupled with rising interest rates and widening balance of payments deficits proved to be a toxic combination, which ultimately erupted in the debt crisis of the early 1980s, with a number of major debtor nations teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. With US financial interests so overextended, the prospect of these defaults was a mightily destabilizing one. The roles played by the IMF and the World Bank grew and began to blur as they helped stave off this crisis in the global financial system by plugging the massive payments problems in the developing world with loans that were accompanied by the interwoven series of conditionalities contained in structural adjustment programs. The conditionalities of SAPs were supposed to set right the economic policies of third world governments in order to ensure they would pay back their foreign creditors. When it came to African countries, an influential World Bank report from 1981 suggested, according to Patel, that the problems on the continent lay not in its attempt to recover from the horrors of European colonialism, nor from ongoing European, US, Chinese and Russian intervention, nor from crippling indebtedness, but from the failure of African governments adequately to manage their countries. Building on this premise, SAPs contributed to transforming agricultural policies in the continent. Patel writes, the imposition of structural adjustment policies reshaped the government and governance of African states with profound impacts on agriculture. The devaluation, systematic defunding of agriculture, and focus on export-oriented growth stalled African per capita food production and substantially harmed the prospects of African agriculture. Structural adjustment reached Indian shores in 1991 with a similar set of prescriptions: a rollback of the state's direct participation in the economy, reining in of state expenditure, and trade liberalization. It should be immediately obvious why this was the beginning of our current agricultural crisis. As we've discussed, our entire agricultural model was propped up by the two pillars of state support and trade protection, and with the neoliberal restructuring of the economy, both these pillars came under serious assault, undermining the viability of the whole model, which, lest we forget, was far from perfect even when it was functioning well. But structural adjustment was just the beginning, only the first assault on third world agriculture. A second assault followed in 1995 with the ratification of the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Agriculture, or AOA, which is basically a set of rules that dictate its signatory countries' agricultural trade policies and at the same time seeks to end domestic agricultural policies that are perceived to negatively impact international trade. It must be pointed out here that signing on to the WTO and its AOA entailed relinquishing a significant amount of national autonomy in determining a country's terms of engagement with the world market. Decisions that were previously deliberated and determined, however unsatisfactorily, at the state and national level by elected representatives were now to be taken at the supranational level in secretive meetings between trade negotiators. In this sense, the WTO as an institution is fundamentally anti-democratic, and this critique would be valid even if it was the most benign, well-meaning institution in the world. In reality, however, the WTO's AOA was the final nail in the coffin of the post-World War II state-centric international food regime and is a formal codification of what has been termed the corporate food regime, cementing the dominance of agribusiness corporations over nation-states and small farmers. Despite its stated goal of reducing subsidies and providing fairer markets for farmers, the actual outcome of the AOA was a restructuring, not a scaling down, of massive subsidies to agribusiness in the USA and EU. This was done by rechanneling subsidies from those considered trade distorting under the AOA and which were targeted for reduction to so-called non-trade distorting subsidies, which would not attract disciplinary action at the WTO. At the same time, subsidies in the developing world were very conveniently deemed trade distorting and had to be reduced, a gross injustice considering that the concept of trade distorting subsidies under the AOA is highly dubious and that developing world subsidies pale into insignificance compared to the amount of money the developed world, especially the USA and EU, spend to prop up their agriculture. In the year 2000, 5 years after the signing of the AOA, the World Bank estimated that rich OECD countries were still spending an equivalent of $1 billion a day in agro subsidies. During the same period, the average EU subsidy per cow stood at $2 a day, meaning that a European cow had a higher income than probably 1 billion of the world's poorest people. With their subsidies secured, large corporate farmers and agribusinesses in the developed countries could flood the world market with their artificially cheapened commodities thanks to the binding commitments under the AOA regarding removal of all trade barriers except tariffs, which were also subject to gradual reduction. In this way, the ratification of the AOA marked an acceleration of India's agricultural crisis, as the twin pillars of state support and trade protection, already under assault after structural adjustment, were subjected to further scaling back. The dilution of priority sector lending norms and increased commercial focus of public banks resulted in a decline in the availability of formal credit in rural areas. Between 1992 and 2013, the share of cultivator households' debt outstanding to commercial banks fell from 35% to 30%. Input subsidies, especially on fertilizers and irrigation, were also reduced, leading to an increase in input costs for cultivators. At the same time, public spending on research and extension services also slowed down in the 90s and 2000s, causing cultivators to rely increasingly on private dealers for seeds and inputs, which increased costs further. On top of all this, central and state government expenditure on rural development as a percentage of GDP declined significantly over the 90s, resulting among other things in the neglect of local irrigation and a reduction of non-agricultural employment opportunities previously provided by government infrastructure schemes. Marketing and price supports, which had always been more concentrated in the core Green Revolution regions and on only a few crops, were steadily eroded as states amended the APMC Act and the Essential Commodities Act to allow private sector players to purchase directly from cultivators, promoted contract farming, and set up private unregulated markets. If we take trade liberalization into account, we see that all 6 of the institutional support structures we had identified in the previous chapter were undermined to varying degrees in the post-structural adjustment and WTO era. The adverse impact of the withdrawal of these supports is summarized by the economist Jayati Ghosh as follows. Agriculturists have placed greater reliance on monetized inputs and faced rising prices of such inputs as domestic explicit and implicit subsidies have been withdrawn. Around the same time, various import controls on agricultural products have been withdrawn so that the level of domestic output prices is increasingly determined by the threat of potential imports, if not actual imports. Export subsidies as well as export taxes have been reduced or done away with so that local producers face international markets and volatile world prices in a rather unprotected manner. The consequence is that farmers have been caught in a pincer movement of rising input prices and falling or volatile output prices, which has rendered cultivation more risky and often financially unviable. These difficulties have been compounded by the reduction or withdrawal of various government support systems, ranging from output price support to input and credit provision. Basically, the story is this. The historical conditions and intellectual climate that birthed, shaped and sustained the Green Revolution model lost relevance by the 1980s. The wave of structural adjustment across Asia, Africa and Central and Latin America that followed, along with the WTO's AOA, can be seen as the tools with which the old model was sought to be altered in a way so as to bring it in line with the principles of the newly hegemonic ideology of free market neoliberalism. While the stated principles of neoliberal ideology reject state support and promote the removal of trade barriers, the application of these principles have hardly been universal. Post AOA, not only did developed countries continue using tariff and non-tariff means to selectively protect their own markets, but more importantly, they did not scale back their massive subsidies, but in fact, in the case of the US and EU, increased them. The selective application of neoliberal policies in agriculture only to developing countries means that small and marginal cultivators in these countries interact with international markets from a position of substantial disadvantage. They end up competing against massive, fully mechanized corporate farmers in the developed world who utilize their subsidies to depress the world market prices of agricultural commodities, thus lowering incomes of cultivators in the third world. Even as costs rise, not only due to the withdrawal of state supports, but also because of the extension of intellectual property regimes to seeds leading to their commodification, soil exhaustion and pest resistance which requires the use of ever larger quantities of fertilizers and pesticides, the depletion of groundwater sources which necessitates greater expense on irrigation. Further, the existence of a handful of massive multinational corporations which control the trade of agricultural commodities and a similarly small number of companies that dominate the market for the inputs farmers need and use seriously undermines their bargaining position while buying and selling, given the vast disparities in social and economic power between them and the near monopolies they transact with. This intensifies the pincer movement that Ghosh describes from both sides, that is, the tendency is towards earning less and having to pay more. The resultant unviability of peasant agriculture arising from the collapse of the old model and its subsequent restructuring constitutes the agricultural crisis. In India, over the last 30 years, this crisis has led, on the one hand, to increased incidence and burden of indebtedness among rural cultivators, triggered an exodus out of agriculture into other sectors, and played a part in more than 3 lakh officially recognized farmer suicides, and God knows how many actual suicides, and who knows how many failed attempts, and how many instances of depression, self-harm, and substance abuse that arise from the fear of slowly, painfully drowning in debt. And who knows how many husbands and wives and children have seen that fear in their partners' or parents' eyes and watched helplessly as they sink deeper and deeper until the desperation erupts into violence, either as self-annihilation or it is directed outwards towards their families and communities. That's one side of the crisis, the systemic violence of our economic model, which us good, respectable middle-class folks are supposed to either cheer, ignore, or mutely observe. There is, however, another, more hopeful side. The crisis has also sparked off numerous grassroots movements, some of which try to provide an alternative to the economically and ecologically destructive practices of industrial agriculture by focusing on soil and water conservation, natural inputs, free seeds, etc. While other movements have focused on the preservation and restoration of institutional supports, such as the anti-WTO protests of the early 90s right through the years to the massive farmers' movement of 2020-21 that mobilized to oppose the single most significant attempt at the neoliberal transformation of Indian agriculture in decades. Popular resistance and rural distress have, so far, prevented the total neoliberal transformation of Indian agriculture, but that has not and will not deter our esteemed policymakers and respected economists from continuing to try to push it down the country's throat. Firstly, because they don't really care that much about popular resistance, and secondly, in their minds, rural distress is rooted not in the breakdown of the old Green Revolution model, but rather in the incomplete neoliberalization of Indian agriculture. So, their prescription for alleviating the crisis is to completely do away with all forms of institutional support, except maybe some kind of small direct cash transfer, get rid of all barriers to trade, marketing, and storage of agricultural commodities, dismantle government procurement and subsidized food distribution, revoke land ceiling laws, and enable easier land acquisition. Their idea is to move away from what they perceive to be the outdated notion of food security, which they contend has skewed cropping patterns in favor of wheat and paddy, and instead focus on high-value horticultural products, cash crops, livestock, and marine products, with the aim of capturing export markets, which would also provide foreign exchange to buy cheap food grains from the international market if domestic supply is unable to meet demand. Further, deregulation and liberalization of the sector will, according to neoliberal advocates, attract domestic and international capital in sectors such as corporate contract farming, factory farming, trading, warehousing, processing, etc., bringing efficiency gains from economies of scale, innovation and technology adoption, and also create jobs in the non-agricultural sector. This is the utopia of neoliberalized agriculture that free market apostles want us to imagine for India. What is remarkable is that the people who say that we should be going down this particular path, who are also the same people who have nothing but condescension and contempt for farmers, because of course farmers don't know what they're talking about, right? They don't know what the real issues of Indian agriculture are. They just work in the fields their entire lives, They're not unbiased experts who have facts and graphs and PowerPoint presentations to support their arguments, right? I'm sorry, but it's remarkable to me that these people can paint this picture of a rosy future where the market will fix Indian agriculture, and we're supposed to take it seriously and not fall to the ground laughing and strip them of whatever undeserved credibility they've somehow gained in society. Because either these people are dumb and they don't really know what they're talking about, or they think everyone else is dumb and so no one will ever find out that every major developing country which fully neoliberalized its agriculture under force of structural adjustment and or free trade agreements suffered disastrous consequences which were disproportionately borne by the poor. Take Mexico, for example. The birthplace of the Green Revolution, Mexico, like India and so many other countries in the post-World War II era, had a pretty comprehensive array of institutional supports for its commercial agriculture, and in addition had enacted a far more comprehensive land reform program than India ever did. In a period of about 15 years, however, everything changed. First came the debt crisis of the early 1980s, which brought in its wake structural adjustment and literal economic stagnation. Mexico's GDP showed no growth between 1982 and 1988. By 1993, Mexico had removed all restrictions on capital movements, which led directly to the country's second financial crisis in 13 years and an even more severe economic downturn than the one in the previous decade. Around the same time, Mexico entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement or NAFTA with the USA and Canada, which came into force on January 1st, 1994. Exactly 1 year later, on January 1st, 1995, the WTO and its agreement on agriculture came into effect, of which Mexico was also a signatory. So Mexico went through it all: structural adjustment, NAFTA, WTO, which made it an almost perfect candidate for implementing all sorts of neoliberal policies for the supposed benefit of Mexican farmers. And indeed, the policies implemented were far-reaching, enough to bring tears of joy to the eyes of any Indian neoliberal economist. State intervention diminished, credit was individualized, and the Rural Development Bank reduced the amount of credit available for each farmer, as well as the number of farmers and crops eligible for credit. Subsidies fell. Most of the public sector enterprises that manufactured farm inputs or that collected, marketed, or processed farm products were privatized. State services like agricultural extension, crop insurance, and grain storage were privatized. The subsidies that were implicit in floor prices were eliminated, and the subsidies of numerous other public sector goods and services were slashed. Running parallel to this thorough program of dismantling state support for agriculture, going much further than India, was agricultural trade liberalization, culminating with the immediate removal of agricultural tariffs under NAFTA. NAFTA was sold to the Mexican people by their government as a path to the modernization of agriculture and the whole economy. Tim Weiss writes, "The Mexican government's plan, clearly articulated at the time, was to reduce the agricultural population to less than 10% of the workforce by making traditional producers compete with US farmers. Mexico would import cheaper crops from the United States, making food cheaper for consumers, and the country would become the chosen export platform for winter fruits and vegetables into a US market hungry for year-round fresh produce." And so, starting on January 1st, 1994, Mexican farmers, 40% of whom at the time were dependent on the cultivation of corn, the staple food of the country, competed with American farmers. And well, they lost. Badly. And not because American farmers were more efficient and productive due to the use of machinery and chemical inputs, but rather due to the price of American corn being artificially lowered by obscene amounts of government subsidies. In fact, things are the other way around. Industrial farming is so costly and inefficient that the only way to compete is to subsidize it to the extent that the price at which it is sold is much below the cost of its production, and actually much below its real cost of production, which would ideally include the economic cost of its ecological destructiveness. And this is what happened in the case of Mexico. Weiss estimates that between 1997 and 2005, American corn was exported to Mexico at 19% below what it cost to produce, at the same time as government subsidies for Mexican farmers were drastically cut. As a result, Mexico, the place where corn was first domesticated more than 8,000 years ago, which had been largely self-sufficient in meeting the demand of its staple grain pre-NAFTA, found itself importing by 2007 about 1/3 of its corn requirements from abroad, mostly from the US. As the local market was flooded with cheap American corn, corn, US exports increased by 400% from pre-NAFTA levels, and prices crashed. Cultivating corn was no longer viable for small producers, many of whom were pushed out of farming. As Weiss writes, according to the 2007 agriculture census, an estimated 2.3 million people had left agriculture since 1993, more than 1/4 of the farming population. But even as millions were pushed off the land and were forced to choose between working as an agricultural laborer or joining the informal workforce in the cities or trying to cross the increasingly militarized American border to find work up north, at least the cost of food went down, right? That was the promise. Import cheaper corn and the cost of food will go down. That seems fairly straightforward, right? Well, not really. Turns out that if everything from import, export, marketing, processing, retail and distribution is controlled by a few giant companies, mostly US owned, then even the one seemingly obvious benefit of letting in cheap imports isn't passed on to the consumers. Peter Rossett writes that major international agribusiness players like Cargill, Arancia, Minsa, Archer Daniels Midland and its Mexican partner Maseca, and a few others came to control the bulk of import-export trade in corn on both sides of the Mexico-US border. Further, with the privatization of grain marketing within Mexico, many of the same companies also came to control the domestic market. Rossett writes, Cargill, Arancia, Maseca and Minsa have also become the principal buyers of maize from Mexican farmers, and Minsa and Maseca dominate the processing, distribution and retailing of tortillas, the principal staple of the Mexican diet, which are made from maize. Perhaps because the entire maize commodity chain is so concentrated in the hands of so few companies, Mexican consumers have failed to benefit from cheap imports. Thus, 10 years into NAFTA, tortilla prices were 30% higher in real terms than before. And apart from this steady price increase, there is always a possibility of a dramatic spike in staple foods when a third of your domestic consumption is met with imports, as Mexicans found out in early 2007 when the price of tortillas rose by 40% in a period of just 3 months, leading to massive protests in the country. Supply shortages in the US were partly responsible for the price hike, as US government subsidies made it more profitable for American farmers to convert corn to ethanol, a biofuel, rather than grow it for human consumption. Another reason for the price hike was, of course, good old-fashioned speculation, which is easy to do when most of the market is controlled by like 4 companies. Unsurprisingly, the near monopoly control of the corn trade by private multinationals ensured that a hike in international prices did not result in an increase in producers' incomes. And what of the promise of small farmers benefiting from supplying tropical horticultural crops to the US? Well, first of all, there is a significant entry barrier in the exotic produce export market due to higher investment requirements for such crops in comparison to staple crops. For example, the required investment per hectare, writes Walden Bellow, for corn was $210. The same for melons ranged from $500 to $700. For snow peas, it was upwards of $3,000. For broccoli, more than $1,000, and for cauliflower, the number was $971. Such high investment costs, between 2 to 15 times that of staple crops, were obviously prohibitive to small farmers. But further worsening their exclusion was the drying up of cheap government credit due to structural adjustment. In addition to the issue of price uncertainty that plagues all agricultural commodity markets, producers must also contend with competition from other regions and countries producing the same product, which hardly provides the stable demand necessary for long-term prosperity. For example, the export of mangoes from Mexico to the USA went through a boom phase starting in 1992, and by 1997, 84% of all mangoes purchased in the US came from Mexico. Within the next 5 years, though, Mexican exports stagnated as countries like Peru, Brazil, and Ecuador expanded their mango exports to such an extent that Mexico's share of the American market was down to 63% by 2002. Such an intensely competitive global environment, not just between but within countries as well, which requires considerable investment in seeds, inputs, irrigation, and not to mention refrigerated storage and transportation due to the highly perishable nature of the produce. All this tips the scales in favor of large commercial farms run by people with deep pockets, oftentimes in partnership with American capital, who are able to survive and capture export markets. Small farmers are more likely to be found working for a pittance or in conditions of near slavery as immigrant agricultural laborers for such large commercial farms, rather than benefiting from the exports directly. Thus, even though technically the American market is accessible to all Mexican farmers, the benefits of exporting commodities to the US are limited to only a few. Peter Rossett estimates that Mexico's agricultural export earnings went to just 7% of its farmers. For the rest of the rural population, things weren't going so well. Rural poverty went up to 55%, with 25% living in extreme poverty. There are therefore clear winners and losers in Mexico's decades-long neoliberal experiments with agriculture. Rossett writes, "The losers have been the vast majority of Mexico's farmers, especially the peasant and indigenous majority. US dumping of underpriced farm products on the Mexican economy has severely undercut their ability to make a living. On the other hand, the clear winners have been American agribusiness companies and their Mexican partners and subsidiaries. Other relative winners include the 7% of Mexican farmers able to compete in the export market. Sadly, this same story of food self-sufficiency turning into import dependency, of substituting food with export crops, of support institutions being gutted and dismantled, of trade liberalization being used as a wedge to open new markets for the benefit of a few agribusiness giants and their local partners, of the reversal of meager land reforms, of the destruction of rural communities and their cultures, of the displacement and extinction of native plant species and loss of biodiversity, of hunger, malnutrition and disease, of growing inequality, of ecological catastrophe. This is not just a story of Mexico. This same story, with local variations of course, has played out in the Philippines, in much of sub-Saharan Africa, from Malawi to Ghana and Cameroon to Senegal, and virtually all of Latin America, even in Brazil and Argentina, considered to be the poster children of developing countries who have managed to become agricultural export powerhouses. This is not a story of long-term prosperity built on a foundation of equality and sustainability. It is the exact opposite. Nor is it a story of progress. It is the exact opposite, a story of the end of the semi-autonomous Third World National Development Project that had sprung from the ashes of World War II, and following its collapse, the regression of these countries, including India, to conditions and relations that resemble in some very crucial ways those that existed during the high noon of 19th century imperialism. I have dwelled far too long on the negative aspects of the Green Revolution to be suspected of harboring an urge to resurrect it in its pre-90s form. No, the old model is gone. Its demise is not only inevitable but also desirable. But to use the drawbacks of the model as an excuse for the complete withdrawal of the state and its supportive institution from agriculture is to not only throw the baby out with the bathwater but also to go back to the ideology of the colonial period, when state intervention was also considered to be the greatest sin and farmers were thrown at the mercy of a deeply imperfect, irrational market. Is it really such a surprise then that we see colonial conditions recreated in 21st century India? Despite evidence of growing nutritional poverty and the persistence of high levels of food insecurity, undernourishment and malnutrition, India has exported tens of millions of tons of wheat and rice over the last 2 decades. While the acute economic distress caused by the pandemic has worsened hunger, food grain exports have reached record highs and are expected to stay there. Does the coexistence of hunger and exports, just like in the colonial period, not suggest that even though there is no shortage of food, forget exports, the Food Corporation of India has been saddled with excess stocks of wheat and rice, way above what it's supposed to maintain. So there's enough food to go around, but a substantial portion of the population which suffers from hunger, malnutrition and nutrient deficiencies doesn't have the purchasing power to access enough of it. What we have here is a recreation of the colonial era phenomenon of suppression of mass consumption, which achieves the same purpose today as it did 150 years ago. That is, it frees up a huge amount of agricultural produce, both food and cash crops, to be shipped abroad to meet the demands of people who have more purchasing power than the poorest of Indians. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the actual mechanism by which this suppression of consumption is carried out is the same today as it was during the British Raj. Those were simpler times. You could just use the land revenue system to crush the peasants with crippling rent and taxation, drive them into debt to make sure they never get to see any profits from selling their crops, and that's how you keep their demand down. In the neoliberal era, however, the same outcome is achieved through, firstly, increasing the cost of living via the privatization of essential services like transportation, health, education, electricity, etc., which, by the way, affects everyone, not just the agricultural sector. The second part is to increase the cost of credit, as farmers need to increasingly rely on informal sources of credit in the absence of cheaper public bank loans. And finally, there is the increase in the cost of production, a result of a withdrawal of subsidies on inputs, electricity, diesel, etc., and the adoption of an intellectual property regime introduced under the WTO in the 90s, which allows agribusiness giants like Monsanto and Cargill to charge monopoly prices on every bag of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides they sell to farmers. But this is just one arm of the pincer, the cost arm. On the income side, we have pretty much recreated the colonial conditions for more than 90% of farmers who do not have access to support prices and regulated markets, who face international commodity prices and their volatility with virtually no protection, and whose indebtedness and precariousness compels them to part with their crops at whatever price they can get, which is oftentimes not enough to cover their ballooning costs. This is the modern mechanism by which rural demand and by extension consumption is suppressed. But this is not enough. So eager are we to go back to the age of imperialism that we can't stand the tiny minority that does have access to regulated markets. These are the rich, spoiled farmers that were villainized in protests last year. It is alleged that these selfish folks are actually harming the interests of the rest of the farming community by clinging on to our current aging marketing infrastructure, which is unorganized, fragmented, inefficient, bureaucratic, and run by corrupt middlemen. And by doing so, they're hindering the development of a high-tech, fully private corporate agricultural market, which it is argued would bring higher prices to Indian farmers because it will be efficient and market-driven. Except when one looks at the current global food system, it becomes clear that being enmeshed in global corporate commodity chains is by no means a surefire way to increase farmers' incomes. In fact, in organized commodity chains, profits are concentrated in processing, distribution, and retail, and do not end up going to the actual producers. We've seen this in the case of Mexico, and the same more or less generalizes. And why would they have any interest in sharing profits with farmers? We're talking about massive global corporations with huge market shares whose main aim is to pay as little as possible for the product they're buying and sell it at a higher price. The welfare of small farmers is not their business. The size and power of these corporations gives them near perfect control over the entire food system, as Raj Patel writes. Somehow, we've ended up at a world with a few corporate buyers and sellers. The process of shipping, processing, and trucking food across distances demands a great deal of capital. You need to be rich to play this game. It is also a game that has economies of scale. This means that the bigger a company is and the more transport and logistics it does, the cheaper it is for that company to be in the business. There are, after all, no mom-and-pop international food distribution companies. The small fish have been devoured by the leviathans of distribution and supply. And when the number of companies controlling the gateways from farmers to consumers is small, this gives them market power both over the people who grow the food and the people who eat it. So, even in a fully privatized corporate marketing system, there isn't likely to be much relief from the squeeze of the cost-income pincer for the vast majority of small and marginal farmers in the country. It's crazy, because somehow we have managed to create a new parasitical nexus consisting of monopolistic input suppliers, traders, processors, and retail supermarket chains, who, just like in the colonial period, corner all the gains of the agricultural trade and leave nothing for the actual cultivators. Instead of the old unholy trinity of Sarkar, Zamindar, Sahukar, we are now dealing with Monsanto, Nestle, Big Bazaar. The best part is, we don't need imperial viceroys any longer to impose and enforce the reign of the new parasitical nexus. Our own politicians, with the zealous support of domestic capital, have made for excellent local viceroys. After all, they share the same economic ideology as their spiritual ancestors and have a similar taste for playing with the lives of hundreds of millions of people with complete disregard for their well-being. It doesn't matter to them that 60 million people have moved out of agriculture in the last 20 years because their policies have made farming unviable. That's actually considered a good thing, a hallmark of development and progress. And what kind of jobs have we created to absorb all these people fleeing from agriculture? Not a lot of well-paying, stable, organized sector jobs, I can tell you that. Between 2004-05 and 2011-12, the sector which added the most number of jobs was construction, which is not really known for its great quality of employment. But hey, at least we were adding more jobs than we were destroying. But the record of employment generation since 2011-12 is so abysmal that fewer people were employed in 2017-18 than in 2011-12, an unprecedented development in independent India's history. There was a bit of a recovery in employment afterwards until 2019, and then the pandemic hit and worsened it significantly. If the exodus out of agriculture grows, as it most certainly will if our local viceroys continue to push for the corporate takeover of Indian agriculture, are we in a position to provide any decent alternate source of employment to those leaving the sector? If our employment track record of the last 2 decades is any indication, it seems almost impossible. We can't provide them with decent jobs with good pay and benefits, so the only option for them is to become a part of the informal, hyper-exploited, migratory urban workforce. That is what is in store for the people fleeing the agricultural sector. Does anyone in power care? No, the disdain and contempt our local viceroys have for the people they rule over is so staggering. I'm sure it would make our old imperial masters really, really proud. Here's a little story before we finally wrap things up. Lee Kyung-hae was a Korean farmer and peasant organizer. After studying agricultural science in college in the mid-1970s, Lee returned to his hometown of Jiangsu, South Korea, and along with his wife set up a cattle farm, something which had never been done in the hilly terrain and high altitude of the town. His experiment paid off. By the late 80s, the herd expanded to 300 cattle, and Lee's farm became a college of sorts for anyone who wished to learn from his unique farming experience. But then the Korean government opened up the domestic domestic market for Australian beef imports, and prices fell. To make up for the fall, Lee expanded the size of the herd by taking on more loans. But when prices stayed low, he had to resort to selling his cattle to meet his interest payments. And one day, he ran out of cattle to sell, so the bank repossessed his land. The farm was gone. The experience shattered Lee, and he eventually became a fierce opponent of agricultural trade liberalization. He organized farmers' unions, ran for public office, and sat through more than 30 hunger strikes, once outside the Korean parliament, another time outside the WTO office in Geneva. On September 10, 2003, he was on the front lines with protesters clashing against the police at the WTO negotiations in Cancun, Mexico. He went around distributing a pamphlet in which he wrote about the helplessness he'd felt when trying to console the wife of a farmer who had killed himself due to mounting deaths. Then, as his fellow protesters watched, Lee climbed a fence near the barricades, a thin cardboard sign hanging from his neck which read, "The WTO kills farmers." After telling his comrades to not worry about him and continue the struggle, he flipped open a penknife and stabbed himself in the chest. The knife pierced 4 centimeters into the left atrium of his heart, and he was rushed to a hospital where he died several hours later. Lee's tragic, heartbreaking story is just one among the countless tales of lives destroyed by the global corporate food regime. Everywhere this destructive model goes, it commodifies everything. Our land and people, our trees and wildlife, our forests and lakes, our rivers and seas, our soil and air. They mean nothing to the corporate behemoths. They're all just items on a ledger, cells in a spreadsheet, to be owned and exploited until enough market value has been squeezed out to make the bottom line look good and keep the shareholders happy, whatever the consequences. But everywhere, people like Lee, who have to live with the consequences, have fought back. They don't seem to like it very much when their lives and surroundings are reduced to an arbitrary number determined by an irrational market. No, they rise up, start organizing, and try to articulate their vision for a different world. And honestly, that is the only hopeful thing about this whole grim story. There are innumerable links in this global chain of solidarity and resistance going back decades and running right up to the present. From La Via Campesina, an international movement formed in 1993 to represent the interests of millions of peasants, landless workers, women farmers, pastoralists, and fisherfolk from the developing world, to the Indian farmers who gathered in Delhi that same year and burned a copy of the draft WTO agreement as an expression of their opposition. From the landless workers movement, or MST, in Brazil, which has been fighting for redistribution of land to landless families despite decades of state and landlord violence, to the seed satyagraha movement in India, which opposes the patenting and privatization of the seed to protect the country's biodiversity. From the Zapatistas, who carry on the spirit of the Mexican Revolution and who chose the day NAFTA came into effect to stage an armed uprising in the Mexican state of Chiapas, declaring the government illegitimate for being blind to the needs of the people, to the Battle of Seattle during the WTO negotiations in 1999. From the tens of thousands encamped at Singhu and Tikri for a year, living through the sweltering heat and the bitter cold, to the Mexican peasants who related so strongly to Lee's grief and experience that in the aftermath of his death, they took to the streets chanting, "Lee, brother, you've become a Mexican." All of them, and many, many more, they're all links in the same chain, fighting for a better, more just future.